I'm going to go over the code that you're provided for the current assignment. There are two apps. They're intended to run on separate phones, so separate virtual devices. One sends chat messages, the other receives chat messages. This is the chat client. So here you see the structure of a Android project. We have some Gradle scripts. We have the project settings, and we have the module settings. Okay, so this is setting up basic things like Maven repositories and so on, and then the uh, application settings for particular module settings for the app in this are defined over here. So this defines, for example, the package name for this app, the SDK version, various SDK versions, and to work around some bugs in the emulator, I'm giving you a library, so you need to include that library by having this line in your project. I'm also using Google's Guava library, so you need to have this dependency as well to pick that up. Okay, it's also using some support libraries, so we could probably drop that. I want to stay away from support libraries until we've got basic Android stuff down, but it's not a big deal. Okay, so those are the Gradle settings. Here's the library itself. It's included, will be included in your app as a jar file, as an AAR file, Android archive file. Okay, the actual code for the app belongs here. So the main thing you need to look at is the Android manifest. Make sure that it specifies all your activities, otherwise your activities won't launch. We'll be adding other things like content providers and services later on. And by the way, the reason we have client and server separate in this is because we don't have services for managing background threads. So once we get the services, then we'll be able to manage the server basically in the background with a service. And then we can merge these two apps together into one. So this is a very artificial thing we're doing here because we haven't got to all of the Android API stuff yet. Here's the client. There's not that much to say about the client. Datagram send receive is an alternative to the Datagram socket that we're using. Is basically wrapping a socket UDP socket API around TCP sockets to work around bugs in the emulator. If Datagram socket works for you, that's great. But people have had a lot of problems with it. This is something you need to mumble in order to be able to do network I/O on a main thread. You should never ever do this in a production app. In fact, it's really bad practice. We're only doing this because we haven't got the services yet. Services are used to manage background threads. Once we get there, we will get rid of this. We will no longer be doing this kind of stuff. Okay, so this is the onCreate method in the chat client activity. It only has one activity for sending messages. So you need to grab the widgets. Here you set the view to be this layout defined down here. So the chat client. And I won't bother clicking on it. So you need to grab the widgets for the button, for example, and register an on-click listener with the button, the send button. You got an edit text into which somebody puts text. They also put the IP address where they're sending messages to, and also the chat name. Well, let me click on this quickly. Okay, so in the limited design space, it's having some difficulty showing me this. You can maybe expand it out a bit so you get some idea of what the UI looks like. Um, well, there just isn't very much space. Let's just go to text. So there's a vertical linear layout, just lays things out one after the other, and then each line of the UI is described as a horizontal linear layout. Okay, so there's a text view that displays a prompt, and then an edit text which accepts your input. Same here, so there's the prompt for destination host, the chat name you're using, the name that you put on your messages, then the message itself. And then there's a button down here, so you want to register an on-click listener with that button. Okay, you're going to get errors here because obviously there's some stuff that needs to be filled in. So here you need to grab these widgets and initialize these things up here. So for the input text and for the button itself, you want to register this activity itself as an on-click listener. So here's the on-click method. It gets clicked once you've done that, when somebody presses the button, this gets executed. So it's going to grab the data from the UI, and I've given you the code here for actually sending a packet. So construct a send packet with the data, including the send data, which is a set of bytes, an array of bytes, and then send that on the client socket. Okay, the initialization of the client socket is done in onCreate. It's done here. Okay, so that's the client pretty much. There's not much going on with that. Let's look at the server. Okay, structures before. Again, we're using CS522 library. Not much to say about the Gradle scripts. Let's look at the app itself. Okay, there's a bit more here. So there's the main activity, which is chat server. So the chats, let me give myself a bit more room. Okay, so we've got a server socket here. There's some data structures. So some of the data structures I'm asking you to define. So declare messages adapter, which is the declare list view, which is where you're actually going to where the list of messages that have been received are going to be displayed. Let's come down here to the layout. So here's what the UI looks like. There's a list view which lists all the messages, and then there's a button. So there's a send button on the client, there's a next button on the server. The server again is doing all the network I/O on the main thread, which is a big no-no, but we haven't got the services yet, so it's okay to do that. So you press the send button, it does a blocking network receive operation to receive the next message. So you want to send a message on the client and then press next on the server to receive it. Okay, so here we are again. We're enabling network I/O. We're setting up the packet for receiving this. We're also keeping track of a data structure, peers, an array of peers, array list of peers. This is a list of all the chat clients that have communicated with us. We'll be doing this with a database in the next assignment, but for now we're just keeping a list of the peers in this list in the main activity. Again, initialize the UI, so grab the list view, set the adapter for the list view, grab the next button, and register this activity as a listener. Here's the on click. So when you press receive, when you press next, then we do a server socket receive, a blocking receive operation here. We extract metadata from this. We're assuming that the contents of a message are they are separated by, what's the separator? The separator is colon. So separate out the contents of the messages. So the chat name, the message itself, write this to the log. Okay, so once we've extracted the information about the message, then this to do is you need to add this into the list view. The way you do that is you add it into the adapter. So the adapter maintains an internal list of the stuff that's being displayed. It's just going to be a list of strings. So you put the name and the message together in the adapter. So this is very simple. There are better ways of doing this. For example, instead of having just lists of strings with chat name and message, you might have a list of structured message objects, and each line will be a 2-line display with the chat name above and the actual chat message below it. So that gets into more sophisticated use of adapters that we'll get into in later assignments. Okay, this is just stuff to do with the sockets. So one thing that's different from the client is we'll put a menu on the server. There's only going to be a single menu item, but this is where we get started with menus. The menu is actually defined down here. So chat server menu. But the menu shows just a single item, which is list of peers. So the idea is in the In the server, you will get to see a list of messages, and then there's a menu that says peers. If you click on that, that will take you to a list of all the peers you've heard from. Using peer to specify people who are sending you those chat messages. Okay, so there's two things to do. First of all, on create options menu, this gets called to actually display the menu. So you can look at the lectures for this week to see what should go in this. It's only 2 lines of code. And then once somebody actually selects an item from the menu, then this gets called an options menu item select options item selected. Get the item ID of the menu item and check to see which of these it is. So we've defined them in the chat server menu. If you look at the text view, so it's defined as the ID of this is peers. So we check to see if it's peers, and this is where you launch a subactivity. The subactivity is just to display the peers. You're not getting a result back, so you will need to provide a list of the peers. Okay, where am I going to get that from? You're going to get that from this data structure here. So as you receive messages from clients, you add them, new clients, you add them into this peers. Okay, and there is an operation add peer, which will check to see for give new peer if somebody is already in the list of peers. Then don't do anything. Otherwise, if they're not in the list of peers, then add them into this list of peers. Okay. All right. The codes, the subactivity that you launch to view the peers is view peers activity. This is just some exercise with the Android UI, some pretty basic stuff. So display a list of peers. Where am I going to get this from? So you're going to pass this peers as a parsable array list extra. Okay, so here get intent in activity gets the intent that was used to launch this. You will have in chat server, when you launch this, you will have added the list of peers in as a parsable array list extra to the intent. Okay, so now in view peers activity, I get this out. The key is defined here as a static literal string. And inside of this, and there's a layout also defined view peers for a layout. Once this activity will display a list of all the people who sent chat messages, and it's possible for somebody to click on one of these. If they click on this, so on item click needs to be registered in on create as a callback for this activity. This responds to selecting one of these peers. We get the peer, the current position. We add them as a parsable extra. Here's an example of how to add an extra into an intent. Passing this in and then launching the view peer activity. Okay, this is how you launch a subactivity. View peer activity. This is intended to just display information about a particular chat client. Okay, all right. Okay, so we need to be able to pass peers and lists of peers as intent extras. In order to do that, so these peer objects contain all the metadata about peers. There's not much going on with them now. We'll be adding more in later. We might be adding in, for example, GPS coordinates so we track their current location. So we'll put all that into what we'll call an entity class. So you'll notice that there are two sub-packages, activities and entities. So activities define the activities. We'll be using entity classes to define the entities that are part of our domain model. They'll just be data objects. We won't put any behavioral logic in them because we'll actually be passing them potentially back and forth between components. So a peer class has things like there's the chat name, there's the last time they sent us a message, where they sent the message from. Port is perhaps not useful, so maybe we should just get rid of that. But the other stuff is still useful. Now, this will be using a database in next assignment. So this is to track the database ID of the peer. Now, the key thing is that a peer entity object, it must be possible to transmit this from one component to the other. The other component may not necessarily be in the same process. We need to pass as an intent extra. There are other ways in which we need to pass something as data. So how do we package it up in such a way that it may need to move across address spaces? So this is where Android's API exposes its fast API, its fast IPC. So objects that can be transmitted potentially between processes must implement the parsable interface. So peer implements parsable. That means that there's a write to parcel method you need to define that writes the contents out to a parcel. So you can read the documentation on parcels to see what the operations are. So out provides a bunch of operations for writing out the contents of it. So for example, out dot write int, for example, you use that to write out an integer quantity, for example. Okay, so you have to write out the fields of the object out to the parcel one by one, and then there's a constructor which takes a parcel as its input, and it reads from that parcel. So here you might say in dot read int, for example, and that would, so you call this, and we'd say, for example, id equals in.readInt, except it's a long, so you want to say out dot write long of id. Here you want to say read long. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And one other thing you need to do is you need to define this static final field creator creator field that has two operations: create from parcel. All this is going to do is it's going to invoke the constructor for peer, and then new array list, which is just going to create a list of arrays of the given size. This is just used inside of Android when it gets a parsable object. It uses a creator field to actually create one of these parsable objects, or create an array of these parsable objects. Okay, so how you're going to use that is here, when I'm invoking view peers activity, I'm going to pass a list of peers to this as an array list. I've created an array list, so I'll create an intent, and that intent is you can add an array list, array list of parsable objects as an extra to the intent that's used to launch this view peers activity. And then in view peers activity, you extract that list of peers by doing this. So this is your first exposure to parcels. They're an important part of the Android API. In Java and enterprise applications, you use Java IO serializable to specify that an object may be serialized to be transmitted, be saved on disk, or transmitted between processes. But the problem is that relies on the reflection API, which is too slow for Android. So instead, you have to write it yourself by implementing these parsable interfaces.